Welcome, friends, to this special May Day edition of Global Capitalism, a program we bring to you every other month, a project of Democracy at Work, the organization that hosts and prepares these programs. I want to welcome you, partly because May Day is an important holiday around the world, celebrating the working class of people, their sufferings, their triumphs, their struggles, and partly because the conditions of the working class here in the United States, where we are based, is full of struggle these days in a way that has not been true for the American working class and the American labor movement for a long time. It is, in short, a special program in a number of ways. Let me begin by summarizing those ways. We have a level of labor militancy, of drives to unionize unorganized workers, of strikes, of demands of workers for all kinds of improvements, all of which are at record levels, at least as far as the last several decades are concerned. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that the level of movement in the working class of the United States hasn't been this positive, hasn't been this strong since the Great Depression of the 1930s, in short, for almost a century. So we have much to talk about, much to explain, much to celebrate, and much to speculate about, and that's what we're going to do. Before jumping in, I want to acknowledge yet another change that's part of all of this. For some time now, we have had one of you, a volunteer, Charlie Fabian by name, who has been helping us handle all kinds of communications, doing various kinds of research. Charlie is a veteran of the American labor movement. He has held countless jobs and worked for a handful of the major unions here in the United States. He knows from his personal life experience all about the labor movement, its strengths, its weaknesses, the corners that are well lit and those that are obscure. And we have asked him now to move up to become a regular contributor of his insights about the labor movement to Democracy at Work. And if you go to our website, democracyatwork.info, look for Charlie Fabian, and you will see there his insights, his analyses, his news items about the American labor movement and what is happening in it, to it, and how it is impacting the larger society. And I want to thank Charlie particularly for helping to produce today's presentation. Okay, let's begin. And the first question we want to ask is, why? What are the causes that contribute to so dynamic, so alive, so enthusiastic a labor movement here in the United States today? And by labor movement, I mean both organized labor in unions, which is a small part of the American working class, and the vast majority who remain, for the time being, not yet organized. We could go back for a long time. The roots of the American union movement, for example, are well over a century and a half old, but we won't. We don't have the time. So we're going to start more recently, because we're looking for what were the signs of the rebirth, if you like, of the renaissance of the American labor movement. And so we're going to begin with 2008, that stunning crash of global capitalism here in the United States, but around the world. a crash from which in many ways we have not yet recovered. But the part of that crash that I think most immediately contributed to shock the American working class was that they demonstrated that the notion that the American capitalist system was an endless story of improvement, of growth, of expansion, of rising standards of living was not true. That the statements made by leaders that they can control and manage the economy to avoid the kinds of collapses that had been associated with the 19th and 20th century, that those leaders' promises of that sort were also untrue. But perhaps the most dramatic story was the spectacle of the United States government handing out hundreds of billions of dollars to banks, major banks in this country that were, technically speaking, bankrupt, to keep them going. Bailing out corporations like Caterpillar, General Motors, and others with vast amounts, tens of billions of dollars at a time. Meanwhile, as the corporate sector ran to Washington, often begging for the support from the same government that they had mocked year in and year out as an unnecessary addition to the powerful private sector that carries the system. Here were all the private leaders begging to be saved by the public sector that they had mocked. No one missed it, just like no one missed the bailing out with taxpayers' money of these private corporations. The only thing more dramatic than all of that was the spectacle alongside it, a spectacle of huge unemployment, enormous suffering, spreading across the working class, for whom there were scarce supports. The people doing the bailing were not themselves being bailed out. And it meant that the American dream that had been promised to all American workers was in fact moving out of reach for most American workers, and they saw it, and they lived it, and they felt it. It took a while for it all to settle in to the brain. American working people did not want to see what was in front of them, did not want to think about what was in front of them. Those who could were the ones most immediately affected, the younger people whose job opportunities disappeared, in some cases overnight, and who found themselves in growing difficulty with nothing much to look forward to. So in 2011, barely a couple of years after this great crash, we had the Occupy Wall Street movement. Very, very important. Young people, particularly young people with jobs, whose educations were behind them, but whose jobs were changing or disappearing, protested. The most important thing about the Occupy Wall Street movement was the speed with which it spread across the country, everywhere, was the size it attained almost overnight, was the fact that it demonstrated that millions of Americans were sympathetic to the occupiers, supported them, cheered them on. And the slogan was even more important. Up until that time, the legacy of anti-communism coming out of World War II, the McCarthy era, the demonization of everything left-wing, had meant that social movements for poor people, for working class people, for people who believed in peace or civil rights, had been very careful not to raise the economic issue, not to raise the struggle between workers and capitalists, employers and employees. Those issues were muted, if not excluded altogether, for fear that they would bring down the wrath of anti-socialism, anti-communism, and destroy whatever movement had been built up for welfare, for peace, for civil rights, and so on. Contrary to that tradition, developed in the 1940s and dominant to 2011, contrary to that, the Occupy movement put the economic issue front and center. An amazing change. The number one slogan of Occupy, let me remind you, was the struggle that we were to think about in terms of the 1% at the top and the 99%, the rest of us. That wasn't running away from the economic issue. That was putting it right up front, saying that a core problem that this movement protested was a division of the society according to wealth, according to income, according to economic power and influence. Wow. This was an extraordinary change in the scenery. It was saying to the American people, there's a movement here that doesn't like the economic system we've got with the economic divisions it gives us. And out of it came the working class response. And that took many forms, but one of them that I want to stress here is something that came to be known as the Fight for 15. An enormous movement starting in many of the retail, fast food, low-wage, service sector jobs that demanded $15 per hour as a kind of minimum base wage, which was much higher then already than the legal minimum wage. The legal minimum wage then, 2011, was $7.25 an hour. To show you what the labor movement still has to deal with, I should mention to you that now, 10 years later, it's still $7.25 per hour, even though we've had an inflation in the prices minimum wage earners have to pay every single year since it was last raised to $7.25 an hour, which was in the year 2009. Wow. And we began to see in the Fight for 15 success, the ability of low-wage workers to be organized, to get together, to understand and to achieve solidarity, collective action. Wow. This was another contributor to a gathering storm of working class thinking and action and initiative and movement. The next step in this gathering storm, the decision of a still relatively obscure senator, Bernie Sanders, to run for president starting around 2015. He was obscure in part because he did not reject the title socialist. Although he worked with the Democratic Party, he kept that name. He kept that label. He did not run away from it, as so many others had done throughout the period after 1945, the Cold War, the anti-socialism, anti-communism, hysteria of that time, so carefully cultivated by the political and business leaders in the United States. No, he said, I believe in a kind of socialism. His model was Scandinavian. He loved to talk about Denmark. But it was unmistakable that he was staking out a position to the left of the Democratic Party, a left wing that had been all but eradicated in the labor movement as part of the Cold War and the rolling back of all that had been achieved by the powerful labor movement of the 1930s. And then the surprise that Bernie Sanders, the socialist, didn't get the predicted 1% of the vote. He got much, much more. He showed that underneath the repression of the Cold War years, there had lived and grown and matured a critique of the system of capitalism, an interest in, a pursuit of, and a certain welcoming of socialism right here in the United States, across the country in many, many ways. It was a remarkable demonstration that there was a basis for a renewed labor movement in the fight for 15. There were allies, if such a labor movement could rebirth itself. There were allies of the sort that had made Occupy happen. And now there were allies of the sort that made Bernie Sanders a serious, real contender for power. Yeah, a storm was gathering that we are seeing the fruits of now. Let me continue my little history. The next big event is the pandemic, the arrival of COVID-19 and the shutting down in many ways of the economy for much of that time and for much of the working class. And this interruption, coming as it did after the explosive new developments of the 2008 crash of the Occupy movement, of Bernie Sanders, led to a kind of rethinking by the American working class. It had a lot of time because a lot of businesses were closed. You couldn't go to work. You couldn't go shopping. You couldn't do many of the things you had become accustomed to. And so you had time to think and reflect and talk. And you heard a lot about essential workers. Turned out that the people we rely on are often the people we don't pay very well in this crazy capitalist system. And it was hard for people to accept that they were essential workers and yet so deeply disrespected by the economic system that was calling them essential. And so we had new uprisings of all kinds of people demanding respect, demanding as working people that they be treated appropriately. we had the extraordinary response to George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, in which millions of people, black and white and brown, participated, knew that they this time wouldn't turn a blind eye, wouldn't not hear, wouldn't go about business as usual, but would make their rage at a system that works like this, that would kill a person selling cheap cigarettes. And it wasn't just the black people of America with their centuries of suffering that woke up and moved in dramatic new ways. But they, in turn, having been stimulated by Occupy, by Bernie, as well as their long history, they in turn stimulated others by their activism. That's right, Black Lives Matter reacted back on the labor movement that had in fact stimulated it, in part. And so we saw the beginnings of the unionized movement that has grown ever since. At the end of the year 2020, full into the pandemic, it hadn't yet happened. How many Starbucks stores were unionized in November of 2021? 0. In December of 2021, 2 Starbucks had been unionized by the workers there, the famous Buffalo, New York Starbucks. By the end of 2022, 250 Starbucks stores across the country had unionized. It had become a mass movement. The same is true among the Amazon warehouse workers. At first, the unions that were formed were ignored, hassled, harassed, abused, legally and illegally, by Starbucks, by Amazon. Many filings of complaints with the National Labor Relations Board. The workers were fighting back. They weren't quitting. It was hard to form a union. Then it was hard to get the corporation to pay attention. There was always the threat that the company could close a Starbucks as a way used in the past to stop these kinds of movements. But it didn't happen. And a few weeks ago, Starbucks and the corporation Starbucks, the union and the management, agreed to sit down and work out contracts. An enormous victory for the union over the objections of the corporation. Gallup polls began to show that the country was noticing the unions, and the unions were able to make their case to a sympathetic public audience. A Gallup poll, not so recently, but within a year or two, showed that 70% of the American people look favorably upon unions. 10 years ago, that number was 54%. A dramatic change. Then in 2022 and 2023, we had the next stage of all of this. In 2 huge and important national unions, the Teamsters and the United Auto Workers, a new slate of officers defeated the old slate. The old slates that had lived through and had accommodated the decline of union membership, the decline of union power, the decline of union prestige, the decline of the organized labor movement, which has been spectacular over the last 50 years in the United States. Sean O'Brien and the Teamsters, Sean Fain and the United Workers are now becoming national heroes for the gains they have made, the strikes they have organized, the unionizing drives they have either won or are in the process of winning. It now gets major national headlines. It is an enormous transformation. Across the United States, in service businesses, in manufacturing, in profit-making, in nonprofits, workers are organizing. I am a professor. I am watching university professors who resisted unionization for decades in this country now flocking to join unions. The same with graduate students, often used as cheap laborers in universities, playing off their dependence on getting a degree and a job. Across the country, academics are joining unions, and I'll come back in a few minutes to the enormous importance of that little factoid. But it's happening everywhere, even in the union resistance South. A few days ago, the workers in Chattanooga, Tennessee, voted 73% in favor of joining the United Auto Workers at a Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga that had twice before had union elections, close elections, but lost by the union. Now the union not only won, but it won overwhelmingly. Something basic is shifted in the United States. And one of the reasons we're doing this today this way is to make sure you all know it, see it, pay attention to it, contribute to it, and learn from it. When the labor movement is really cooking, as it is now, big changes become possible. Big changes become reasonable to fight for. That's what's emerging in the United States, and that needs to be understood and worked with. I want to turn now to a context within which this gathering storm of labor movement, labor organization has happened. The connection between what I'm about to describe and the labor movement may seem murky, but make no mistake, what I'm about to describe is also a major fueling of the labor movement upsurge. I want to talk about the decline of the American empire. The working class is bound up with the empire. The working class provides the troops, the military, without which that empire cannot last. The working class pays the taxes that fund both the military and non-military aspects of maintaining an empire. The power of the corporations, subsidized by the government, in maintaining the empire, shows the working class what they're up against were they to challenge that empire. Why do I bring this up? Because the American empire is in decline, and that decline is understood by the American working class, even when it's painful to say so, or to face it, or to accept it. Let me be blunt. The war in Vietnam was lost. The United States was defeated. The same is true for the war in Afghanistan. The same is true for the war in Iraq. The same is becoming true for the war in Ukraine. It's really clear for those who are paying attention, who dare to look. The world isn't what it once was. The dominance of the United States, which survived the loss in Vietnam, is no longer the dominant voice. That's why it cannot bend either Russia or China or other countries to its will the way it once could. Very hard to face. Desperate efforts to pretend this isn't happening, to act as if the United States now had the power it had coming out of World War II, when it was the only major industrial capitalism left standing. Germany, Japan, Britain, France, Russia were all decimated. That couldn't last, and now we know it. It's gone. And therefore, the big, powerful, confronting authority to an American working class don't look so big. Isn't that powerful? Hasn't got that authority. And that plays its role whether people acknowledge it or understand it or not. I would also argue that closely allied to this is the decline of American capitalism. What do I mean? Let me be blunt, again in the interest of time. The United States and its major economic allies are known as the G7. The United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Together, they were the dominant economic bloc in the world for most of the last 75 years. But they aren't anymore. Another bloc of nations, China, the People's Republic of China, and its allies, known as the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. The BRICS together now produce more output, significantly more, than the G7 do. The United States and its allies, let me underscore, has less wealth to dispose of than the People's Republic of China and its allies. And let me remind you that the BRICS have many times the combined population of the G7. More wealth, more people, unquestioned military might. We're in a different world. And so the suspicion begins to arise in the United States. As capitalism here declines, what are we going to see in the way of how the wealth gets managed in a period of decline? We don't really know, because the United States, pretty much back to its colonial origins, has been an economy growing, outgrowing every competitor and growing. That's not true anymore. For the last 30 years, the Chinese economy has grown 2 to 3 times faster than the United States, and that's true as I am speaking to you right now for the preliminary data for 2024, which match those for the last 30 years. Wow. Wow. What about that? Well, the fear is beginning to rise that we're living in a declining economy where it's every economic interest group for itself. The rich are trying to hold on as the economy declines, so that the burden of decline is pushed off on those who are less fortunate, who don't have the wealth, who have no access to offsetting factors as the economy as a whole declines. We're watching the rich get richer, but also smaller in number, while those who can't do well are exploding in number. How long will the American working class tolerate the disadvantage that decline confers on them in a society organized in the way that it is? And the answer to that question is already in the air, and people know it even if they can't link it to the declining larger empire. The inflation of the last several years. Let me remind everyone what an inflation is, since the mass media don't do that. Who determines prices in a capitalist economy like ours? Who decides whether we have an inflation? Because remember, all inflation means prices in general are rising. That's all it means. But if inflation is rising prices, then the first question is, who raises the prices? And you all know the answer. It's the employer class. It's the capitalists. It's the people who own and operate this private economy. They're the ones who decide whether and by how much prices go up or down or stay the same. If there's an inflation, it means the 3% of our people listed by the U.S. Census as employers, they're the ones that are doing it. And if you know anything about economics, if you've ever been near a business school, you will know that what businesses do when they set prices is try to maximize their profits. Raising prices is a way of making more profits. So that's what they're doing. The rest of us are price takers. We have to pay what they charge us, or we do without. An inflation is drawing into itself by the people at the top, the 1%, or if you like, the 3%, who are employers, are gathering more wealth into their hands, and we are parting with more wealth because that's how the name of the game in a market economy, that's how it's played. And when the government responds, as it did, by raising interest rates, as they have been raised, what are we doing again? We're hurting those at the bottom the most. They're the ones who can't afford the higher prices. They're the ones who can't afford the higher interest rates as they play out on your monthly statement from your credit card, if you have one. No, we are moving to squeeze the bottom, 3/4 of us, to hold on to the wealth at the top. That's what happens when an economy and an empire decline. Okay, that's the larger feeling, the larger context for the surge in the labor movement. It's all these phenomena I've gone through with you. Some better understood, some less. Some making people more angry, others making them more resigned. But altogether, they have fueled a demand in the American working class visible everywhere for change, for real change in everything. So I want to talk a little bit with you about where this labor movement is now taking us, because taking us is the phrase I want to stress. The labor movement is an elemental force. It will take this country in new directions. It already has. Things that were thought impossible have now happened. Colleges and universities are becoming union strongholds. They never were that before. Low-wage workers are organizing in effective unions in a way they never did before. So let me talk about 3 phenomena that this rising labor movement is about to change big time. First, we're going to see resuscitated something that once was called the Labor-Student Alliance. What do I mean? A systematic working together of unions and students in school, particularly students in high schools, colleges, and universities. They're going to see their problems as allied. They're going to see each of them that they could be stronger if they got the support of the other. Students could get changes in the university if the working class supported them. Workers could get a better deal from employers if the students were more supportive of them. It's an old lesson, but now it's going to be achieved. And here's one crucial reason why. As the colleges and universities unionize the faculty, the graduate students, you know what they learn? What they never learned before. What worker solidarity can achieve. How to go about building a powerful collectivity of workers. What the power is you get if and when you do that. The natural allies of students, if they're organized, will be other unions in the communities where their schools are located. You're going to see workers reaching out to students as fellow union members, and vice versa. I've spent my whole life in the American educational system. My efforts, and those of folks like me, to teach about the labor movement never came to much because it was such a different world from that which the students believed they lived in. They didn't see the relevance. They didn't understand the concepts. They didn't feel the way they feel now. Nothing clarifies your mind about the capital-labor struggle, the employer-employee conflict, than discovering what your school administrators will actually do to you rather than talking about the lofty goals of education. Clarifies the mind, prepares one for struggle, and changes the way the academic institutions work. They're going to be seen as allies to working people and vice versa. And you're going to see allied actions with much more political power than we have seen before. That's already well underway. The second implication, which I also believe will become very big very soon, is the way a revived labor movement will react to the threat of artificial intelligence to the working class as it now exists. Artificial intelligence is just the latest in a series of technological changes, like the computer, like the robot, like electricity, like fill in the blank. For many of those breakthroughs, millions of people's jobs disappeared, and workers were very badly hurt by the disappearance of their jobs, by the absence of ways to retrain, to refocus, and resume your working life, by the fact that employers saw technology as a way to make more profit and could care less or spend less on helping the workers whose jobs were threatened. Artificial intelligence threatens to do the same. Our media are filled with people writing articles projecting that 10% of this kind of job and 30% of that kind of job will disappear. leading millions of workers to wonder whether their job is secure, whether their future is anything other than painful and difficult for them and their families. But now we're going to have a difference. Workers are developing a sense that they can have their own perspective, they can fight for it, and they can win it. So let me give you a simple example. If artificial intelligence makes it possible for an employer to buy some equipment, some hardware, some software, install this artificial intelligence, and it can do the work of half the labor force, so he fires half the labor force, that is the working class's nightmare. That is a working class threatened by a new technology. But now imagine a labor movement able to say, wait a minute, if the artificial intelligence makes every worker twice as productive as they were before, which is why you can fire half of your workers and the other half can still produce the same amount because they have the artificial intelligence, well then, here's an alternative, Mr. Employer. You cut everybody's workday in half. They keep the jobs, they keep the salary they had before, but they only come 4 hours a day, not 8. And with artificial intelligence, they can produce in 4 hours what before it took 8 hours. That way, the benefit of new technology is the spectacular increase in leisure for the working class, rather than a spectacular increase in profits for the employer class. That's an alternative way to install new technology. That's an alternative way to use new technology. A working class feeling its oats, understanding its situation through all the struggles I've just summarized, will be a working class that says, you're not going to install artificial intelligence in a way that costs us and benefits you. You're going to have to meet us in some reasonable compromise here, Mr. Employer. You're not going to be able to do it, and if you insist, we will strike you. That's what our union enables us to do. We have alternatives that are better for us. We're not going to do what you want while you tell us it's better for everybody, and we know damn well that it isn't. And that brings me to the last of the new initiatives I see already happening, and I expect will become much more pronounced in the years ahead. It's the recognition by the working class that a union is an enormous step forward. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's not the end of the issue. Because in the last instance, when you think about it, what the union does by struggling collectively with the employers is to get a better deal, higher wages, a pension program, a health care support, and so on. You all know. But precisely the win of the workers, the win of the union, the strike, whether used or not, what it gains, the reform of the workplace, is never in capitalism secure. Why? Because all of those things cost the employer money. Pay higher wages, improve working conditions, provide a health care plan, and the employer doesn't want to have to spend that money. That's why the union had to fight for it in the first place. So the employer is incentivized, is provoked, is driven to constantly seek to undo whatever it is workers and their unions win. In the 1930s, workers and their unions won all kinds of things. For example, that minimum wage that started in 1938. But the system has ever since not raised it, even though the prices go up. So the real meaning of the minimum wage has been undone in the years since. Another thing that the workers and the unions won in the 1930s was a public jobs program. When the private sector couldn't or wouldn't hire the millions of people who wanted a job, the government did, providing them with a secure, decent income and a job. We haven't done that again on the scale of the 1930s, even when we've had massive unemployment, like we did in 2008, and we did again in 2020 and 2021. We didn't even talk about it in this country. That's how determined the employers are not to have to pay the taxes that could fund a public jobs program. So we don't have that again. What's my point? If you're a union and you're a worker and you're struggling with the employer, even when you win, you face the endless efforts of that employer to take away whatever you won, to undo whatever you achieved. That's why we don't have a public jobs program. That's why our minimum wage is a global joke on the United States. The business community after 1945 used anti-communism and anti-socialism to undo the gains the New Deal had brought to the American working class through the struggles of that time. And this lesson is understood. And the stronger the union grows, the more people get it, talk to each other about it, and the understanding settles in. Why are we limiting our objectives to merely getting better wages and working conditions? Because if we don't take further steps, then they'll never be secure. Then we will face, as we did after 1945, the loss of all the gains we had once won. And therefore, the labor movement needs another further objective. By all means, fight for a union, fight for better wages, fight for better working conditions, for sure. But don't stop there. Fight also for a change that can make the gains you've won permanent, secure, unremovable. And there's only one way to do that. And that is to end the situation, the very system of employer versus employee. There's a new and different kind of enterprise we're talking about. It really isn't new. It's new for many folks who haven't had a chance to think about it, but it's very old in terms of human history. It's a workplace organized as a community, as a democratic community. It's what some people call worker co-ops. It's a kind of enterprise in which the workers, the employees, are also, the same people, the employer. We hire ourselves. As employees, we don't bargain with other people who have an incentive to undo what we achieve. No, we run the enterprise ourselves. We are not going to struggle to do something and then take it away from ourselves, because that would be crazy. And we understand that it's crazy to be in a system set up like that, to make the mass of people struggle to form a union, to fight an employer, to strike an employer, to bargain collectively, to get an improvement, only to see the employer figure out some way to get around it, to undo it, to dismantle it. That's been the history of the labor movement. And the failures, when you lose what you've worked hard to gain, turn off millions of people. It's a way to destroy the mood, the power, the enthusiasm of a labor movement. If we don't struggle for a changed economic system, converting top-down employer-employee organizations of enterprises into democratic community, co-op organized enterprises, we will have left the job half done, and that will be used against us. The recognition of that will reconstitute something we had a little of in the 19th century in the United States, an alliance between the labor movement and the co-op movement. They understood then that they needed each other, that the way you build co-ops is by having workers learn the benefits of collective struggle against the employer. Just like the workers in the unions discovered, better than bargaining with an employer who's always trying to get around what we win, what would it mean if we ran the enterprise ourselves? We wouldn't have to worry anymore that what we have achieved is insecure. So I suspect, I believe we will see a union movement not only building on the gains we've seen that I've summarized, but seeing opportunities around technical change, including artificial intelligence, around alliances between workers and students, and now around the possibility of alliance with movements to build worker co-ops. I told you that the labor movement, energized, can bring massive changes to a society. We are at that point of an energized labor movement, considering, confronting, imagining where it can go to benefit the American people, and indeed similar things elsewhere. Let's not be held back. Let's explore what is possible now that we have one of the foundations of being able to change the world convinced and mobilized to do exactly that. And nothing is more appropriate to celebrate on May Day than this new, changed, working class reality. Thank you very much for your attention. Please think about the issues that we have raised, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Just follow our website and our announcements for the exact time and place. Thank you.